Git. Chances are you've at least heard of it, or you're one of the hundreds of millions of developers who's using it. It is the standard when it comes to version control systems, whether you're a solo dev or working at a large company, but not if you're at Facebook or Google, and there's a reason for that. This is everything you need to know to get up to speed on Git in 8 minutes or less. Git is what's commonly referred to as a version control system. What this means at a very basic level is that it maintains a history of all of the changes that you make to your code, making it much easier to collaborate with other people and making it significantly harder to completely screw up your code base. This is not a novel concept. There are plenty of alternative options on the market if you've ever heard of things like Mercurial or Subversion, and Git wasn't the first player in this space either. Git was created back in 2005 by Linus Torvalds, who, if that name sounds familiar, also happens to be the creator of Linux. The decision to start building Git was made in reaction to a falling out with Bitkeeper, who was the previous version control system that Linux was using, and when they couldn't find anything else on the market that met their needs, they just decided to make their own. Before we go any further, there's an important point that I want to clarify. Git is not GitHub or GitLab. Git is the version control system itself, and it's open source, whereas GitHub is a web platform that uses Git, and it was acquired back in 2018 by Microsoft for $7.5 billion. I'll talk more in a little bit about GitHub because it's hard to have a conversation about Git without also talking about GitHub, but all you need to know for right now is that Git is not synonymous with GitHub or GitLab. So, what is so special about Git, and why did so many people start to use it? One of the biggest reasons is because it is a distributed model, and what that means is that everyone has their own local working copy that they can make changes to offline, and then everything gets merged back together. This has the added benefit of extra resiliency because everyone who has a copy cloned locally basically has a backup of the repo on their local machine. For the purposes of this video, all the details of how that works really isn't too important, but the main thing to know is that this is in contrast to another popular model, which is a centralized model, like the one that Subversion uses, where there is a single centralized system that everyone has to check out a working copy of, and this is generally considered to be less flexible. Git was also a lot more performant than some of the other alternatives that were on the market. Especially when you're working on a small scale project, you might not really notice some of this, but at the scale of an open source project like Linux or any of the other open source projects that are really popular, you really start to notice some of these performance issues when you're doing large scale collaboration, which naturally for other people who were trying to decide what to use for version control would then look around and see what other people were using, organically leading more people to use Git. Git being an open source project also meant that the community could contribute to it. And especially if you have an active community, that can be a major asset because when people are trying to build something, they'll help make your thing better if it's going to help them do something that they need to do for their own project. Okay, now that we know a little bit about the history of Git, how does it work and how do you use it? It's worth pointing out that Git is really powerful and you can do some pretty crazy stuff with it, some of which has become the stuff of memes. But today I really just want to focus on the core pieces of Git that most people are going to be using. The first step of using Git is that you make a repository or a repo. This is the home of all of your code, and you can do all of this locally. You can use something like GitHub to host your repos, which comes with a lot of nice features, but at the most basic level, all you need to do is install Git locally, run git init, and you're up and running. All of your work lives in branches. Typically, you'll have something called main. In some repos, this is also called master, which is exactly what it sounds like. But you can create other branches. For example, if you're adding a certain feature, you might create a branch called feature/myFeatureName, and then when you're done with that feature, you can just merge your new changes back into the main branch. You can switch between branches and see the full history of your branches really easily, which if you use source control correctly is why it makes accidentally losing your code so much harder. Of course, that requires you to actually commit your code fairly regularly. You can't go back to a commit if it doesn't exist, which is why I am generally committing my code several times per day, but it all comes down to personal preference. When collaborating on a project, here's an example of a common workflow. Clone or make a copy of the repo locally, create a new branch, make your changes, stage those changes locally, which is basically telling it which changes you want to commit, and then you want to save or commit your changes locally with a message explaining what you did. Then you can push your changes up to a remote, which would be something like GitHub. To get your changes back into main, you'll create a pull request, which other people can review and give you feedback to address, and then you can merge back into main. If other people made changes while you were making your changes and you happen to touch similar parts of the code, you might have conflicts, in which case you'll need to resolve those conflicts as part of your pull request before checking in your code, unless you just want to break everything. There's a ton of other commands in Git, some of which you'll use on a near daily basis, things like branch, status, pull, merge, reset. I use the command line for pretty much everything in Git, but you can also use something like the integration in VS Code or a third-party tool just to make your life a little bit easier. At the end of the day, it's still doing the same thing, but you just don't need to memorize all of those commands, even though conceptually you should still understand what's going on. And as promised earlier, talking about how people use Git would not be complete without also talking about GitHub. As of 2023, GitHub has over 100 million users, which means that while it isn't the same thing as Git, in a lot of people's minds it is, because they've never interacted with Git outside the context of GitHub. In the research for this video, I saw figures saying that over 90% of Fortune 100 companies were using GitHub Enterprise. So while there are competitors on the market, I'm pretty sure none of them can come anywhere close to touching GitHub's dominance. In terms of how you use it, GitHub can do a lot of stuff, and it really depends on your workflow how you decide to use it. I'm just gonna put a whole bunch of things up on the screen that you can do with GitHub. I'm not gonna talk about all of them, but as someone who has been using GitHub for years, both professionally and personally, it's great, and they keep making it better. So now that we know a whole bunch of stuff about Git and just how many people are using it, the question is, why aren't two of the biggest companies in the world, Google and Meta, using it? In the case of Meta, they actually used to use Git back in their earlier days up until I think around 2012. At that point, they just had one really large mono repo for Facebook, and it got to the point where Git just wasn't performant enough for what they were trying to do at that kind of scale. I remember reading that they were anticipating that if things kept getting worse the way that they were, that single Git operations were going to start taking on the magnitude of half an hour to go through, which obviously is just not acceptable performance. So when they talked to the maintainers of Git about the changes that they would want to make, they weren't really receptive to it, at least that's the way the story goes, so they decided to pick up and move everything over to Mercurial. Git has improved a lot since then in terms of being able to handle large repo sizes and lots of other things, but obviously moving all of your stuff from one version control system to another is not a decision that's made lightly, so my understanding is that to this day, Facebook or Meta is still using Mercurial. And in the case of Google, it's actually just because they have their own homegrown system known as Piper. Instead of relying on an existing solution like Git or Subversion or Mercurial, they just decided to make their own custom one that they could tune exactly to their needs. This is something that 99.9% of companies could not or should not try to do, but for large companies like Google, this actually isn't that uncommon for them to hand roll their own tools that are only ever going to be used internally. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see me break down other topics, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below so that I know you want me to make more videos like this one. I had a lot of fun doing it. Anyways, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.